The Enola Gay's mission starts from Tinian in the Marianas. The crew has had their final briefing on weather and air-sea rescue. Only yesterday, they have been told of the true power of the weapon they are to carry. The massive bomb has been loaded.
On the morning of August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay flew over the imperial Japanese city of Hiroshima, and then, at 9:15,
the bomb is dropped. The aircraft banks away at high speed. Just 50 seconds later, 15 miles from ground zero, the Enola Gay is rocked by the blast.
"70,000 people were killed in just an instant. A nearly equal number lived but did not survive, or survived with terrible injuries. This was one of the bloodiest days in human history, and it happened in just a moment. This was terrifying. People were burnt, others were charred. Some were just turned into dust or left as stains on the street side. The whole city of Hiroshima was leveled in an instant. Buildings simply disappeared from the face of the earth. This was horrifying. And on that day, we entered into an era where war no longer just threatened countries and nations, but the whole of humanity. But the man who approved the bombs being dropped in the first place, Harry Truman, never looked back. And today, in spite of the tragedies of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Truman is considered as one of the best presidents in American history, and the bombings are still considered as justified by a large majority of Americans. So in 4 segments, let's discuss the war between the US and Japan, the Japanese home front, the American home front, and the blast and its consequences. The American War with Japan began on December 7, 1941, when the Japanese suddenly and deliberately attacked the Hawaiian military base at Pearl Harbor, killing 2,400 people and a number of civilians. Most nobody expected this, not even Hitler and the Germans, close allies of Japan. Immediately, people were in shock. All along the west coast of the United States, false reports came in of a Japanese invasion. FDR was briefed on the possibility of a Japanese invasion and the possibility that this invading force could reach as far east as Chicago in a matter of weeks. Practically every Japanese person on the west coast was put in internment camps for the rest of the war for fear of them being spies. And in the end, not one of them was ever proven to have been a spy. These camps were clearly racist and all around awful, one of the greatest shames in the whole of U.S. history. The Imperial Japanese went further with their POW camps, holding over 32,000 military men in them. These camps were brutal, and some of the worst atrocities ever committed in war were committed here. The list of war crimes the Japanese committed is long and despicable, far too long to talk about fully. Some of these war crimes, though, are biological warfare and completely inhumane human experiments, cannibalism, chemical warfare, forced starvation and labor, attacks on civilian and military hospitals, and mass organized murder of civilians and military alike. One of the worst of these mass murders was the rape of Nanking. Nanking was the Chinese capital city at the time, and over the course of 6 weeks, somewhere between 200,000 to 400,000 non-military civilians were brutally murdered. This was well over double the number killed in both of the atomic bomb blasts. But Nanking was far, far worse. Practically every woman was murdered and brutalized in the worst of ways. In all of the history I know, hardly anything tops the pure and irredeemable awfulness of this massacre. But this was hardly exceptional in the Imperial Japanese strategy. The only reason this particular massacre is so well known is its scale. As the US worked up northwards towards the Japanese mainland, the brutality of the Japanese military, especially towards prisoners of war, only increased. The Japanese and the rest of the world knew that the war was slowly coming to an end, and the question was whether or not the Japanese would surrender soon and bring peace, or whether the war would be prolonged and the death toll would rise. The Japanese chose not to surrender. In the Senjinkan, the Japanese Field Service Code, this no-surrender mindset was heavily promoted. Kamikaze was a part of this sort of tactic. By the end of the war, over 3,800 Japanese men had killed themselves in this way. The Japanese army was probably one of the most devoted of all the armies of that war. Japan had easily the lowest number of desertions all throughout the war, not even close to the other big powers. Imperial Japan had a very effective propaganda department, and it successfully convinced nearly the whole of the Japanese people that these atrocities at Nanking had never been committed, that God was on their side until their very last moment, and that to surrender, ever, is to lose your honor, and that losing your honor was the worst thing a person could do. Japanese propaganda during the war also had some truly disturbing parallels to the American propaganda, being very nationalistic and supporting this country over self ideology. The Japanese didn't just convince the men of their military, they convinced nearly everyone. As invasion and the defeat of Japan loomed, women were taught how to fight with sharpened bamboo sticks. Children learned how to throw grenades, and many young girls promised that they would kill at least one American soldier before they died themselves. Japan was in a complete trance. There are famous true stories of men who refused to surrender at the end of the war, or thought that the emperor's surrender was a psyop to discourage the Japanese from fighting. One of the most famous of these soldiers didn't surrender until the mid-1970s, nearly 30 years after the war's end. The Japanese people were absolutely fanatic about the empire's cause. They believed in the absolute supremacy of the Japanese race over all Europeans, Africans, Americans, and Asians. And they believed that the emperor was almost godlike, and they worshipped him as such. They similarly hated all Allied leaders, and they celebrated openly Roosevelt's death. All across the world where the Axis was in power, Roosevelt's death was celebrated. In Japan, newspapers translated his final words from, quote, "There is a terrible pain in the back of my head," unquote, which he said right before collapsing from a stroke, to "I have made a terrible mistake," words of regret before being struck down by God. In Germany, Hitler broke out the champagne and believed that this was a turning point in the war, that the greatest war criminal of all time had been removed by fate. The Axis genuinely believed in their own delusion that FDR's successor, Harry Truman, would start firing on his own allies, the Soviets. They were wrong. Truman would do no such thing, and defeat for the Axis was days away. 12 days after Roosevelt's sudden death, Hitler would commit suicide himself, and 8 days after that, the Nazis would surrender. After the death of Franklin Roosevelt on April 12, 1945, all of America was shocked. A few months before, Roosevelt had been inaugurated for a fourth term. He seemed like an almost permanent installation in the White House. Many Americans, and probably most of the men currently fighting Germany, Japan, or Italy, could not remember a time before FDR's presidency. And so, nobody really knew Harry Truman, FDR's vice president. Why would they? It was hard to imagine. He was still in his early 60s, that FDR would die. So really, the vice president was not very important. But after FDR did die, Truman did become president, and it was a harsh but necessary transition. His transition to the presidency was probably one of the most unexpected things to have happened in Washington for a long time. Shortly after becoming president, Truman was told that the Army was building an atomic bomb, the most destructive weapon ever thought of by man. The project was such a secret that even as Vice President, the second highest ranking man in all of the world, was kept in the dark about it. Right now, though, Truman's options seemed bleak. Really, he only had one option to end the war, and that was to invade Japan. An invasion of Japan would probably kill thousands, if not millions, both American and Japanese. Scores more would die in much worse ways. Many predicted that this war would go on until 1948, or even later. Before the bomb would work for sure, this was his only real option. His only choice was to hand out death sentences to young Japanese and American men and countless Japanese women and children. A few months later, Truman was told that the bomb had been tested in Arizona. The test had been a success, more of a success than anyone had expected. Truman was elated. He had a new option. He could put an end to the war by just giving one order. He could spare countless lives, but that too came with a cost, a terrible cost. It was a clear but awful decision he had to make. Truman and his advisors decided on a number of potential sites to drop the bomb. It must be a strictly military site. We would not be attacking a city for the sake of attacking a city. We were not bloodthirsty. We were not looking for vengeance. We simply wanted to put an end to this awful war. Hiroshima fit the description the U.S. was looking for, used mostly to make the things of war. Leaflets warning to read this carefully, as it may save your life or the life of a relative or friend. In the next few days, some or all of the cities named will be destroyed by American bombs. Heed this warning and evacuate these cities immediately. These leaflets were dropped over this city and many others which the U.S. were also considering as potential targets. The Japanese pulled the veil over their own people and hid these pamphlets from them, still unwilling to surrender. Truman warned, in no uncertain words, that the Japanese people would go through hellfire if they do not surrender. After many repeated warnings, the Japanese still did not surrender. This was to be expected, but it was necessary, morally speaking, to warn them. Now, all that was left was to drop the bomb, and so we did. On August 6th, we dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, and after they still refused to surrender, we dropped another, this time in Nagasaki. At this point, 200,000 people had been killed. In the immediate aftermath, the Emperor of Japan decided to surrender on August 15th, 9 days after the bombing of Nagasaki. This decision was, even after the dual atomic bombings, controversial in Japan. Some in the Japanese government tried to overthrow the emperor so they could keep fighting. For them, the real loss would be surrendering under any circumstance. They thought they could endure any number of bombings more and prefer it over a national loss of dignity. This coup was put down, though, and the emperor saw surrender through. This was the last of World War II, the deadliest war in the history of mankind. World War II, in total, killed nearly 4% of the world's total population. But you cannot really put a number to the chaos and destruction caused by this terrible war. In America, Truman's decision was met with a mix of shock and gratitude. Many feared the potential of the atomic bomb, and this fear lasts to this day. And for about 50 years after the first two atomic bombs, the two atomic powers struggled with one another, threatening the extinction of mankind. Others, and especially those in the military, were thankful for Truman's decision. By deciding not to invade Japan by foot, Truman's decision to force the Japanese into surrender with the atomic bomb saved countless lives, both American and Japanese. And Truman knew this. He was very empathetic for the Japanese people, living under an empire which had brainwashed them and put them through some of the greatest horrors known to man. Truman was also very gracious in accepting Japan's surrender, giving them very lenient terms. Today, the decision to drop the atomic bomb is probably one of the most controversial presidential decisions of all time, and it is becoming more and more controversial as time goes on. It seems that nearly every great general, warrior, or soldier of nearly any war can agree on one thing, and that is that war is hell. It is hard to justify any act of war, especially one so awful and so destructive. But to put an end to such an already terrible and destructive war, Harry Truman believed that the use of this bomb was his only real option in order to bring the war to the immediate end it needed. But the consequences of the bombings, and more so the very existence of this bomb, have opened Pandora's box. The world is now exposed to greater danger than ever before. While the atomic bomb put a quick end to that war, it now has the potential to put an equally quick end to the whole of mankind. This is a disturbing, and awful, and real threat. And while the short-term results may have justified dropping such awful weapons, it is hard to say whether or not the long-term consequences will justify even that result.
В этом опыте оно длится необычайно долго. Страшной силы сопутствует приходу ударной волны. Это прошла вторая отраженная ударная волна. Постепенно поры воды, сконденсировавшиеся за фронтом ударной волны, рассеиваются, раскаленное облако уходит вверх, увлекая за собой гигантской пыль.